YouTube, and welcome to my 1 month report on my most special of recent projects, the bug jar. Now, what is a bug jar? I know I haven't discussed this as of recently or as of ever, but I'll get into that shortly. As I record this, it is October 30th, so just before Halloween, which I think should be fitting, as I will upload this on the date itself, as it is a rather spooky project to some tastes. Now, let's get into what exactly I did. This is a bug jar, a average Gatorade bottle with a rubber band affixed to it, serving previously a purpose, no longer. Comes with a set of toothpicks, and of course, the bugs, which will not show up clearly in this camera, but I can assure you they are there, and they each have their own unique little details, and as I like to think of them, personalities. Now you might be asking, why would anyone do such a thing as this? Simple reason. Science. I wanted to find out what exactly would happen if I kept the decaying corpses of several creatures of about this size in an environment without oxygen. When I say without oxygen, 90% of the time, the cap is sealed tightly, and I can tell, because they are decaying much slower than anything in the wild naturally would. There's no introduction of mold spores, extraneous oxygen, or any other factors that could serve to help decay the bodies inside. And the second reason is because of an observation I made. Roughly a month ago, at the inception of this project, I noticed there was always a great deal of dead insects floating in my pool. And whenever I found a live insect in the water struggling, I would of course help it, either with my bare hands, or if I was not feeling up to that, I would take a stalk of some nearby succulent plant and fish it from the depths myself. But I noticed there were so many dead ones, and it felt like such a waste, because that's one more bee that can't go back to the hive and help pollinate flowers and bring back nectar to its community and serve its queen. That's one more ant that can't help expand the colony, or in the event of crisis, help move their queen from one location to another. I guess what I'm trying to say is, as much as I'd like you to go, queen, you can't without your drones. But there's no way to bring them back, you know? And even if there were, I don't have the prowess or ability to do so. But I thought, what do you do when something no longer serves a purpose? You try to learn from it and see if there is a purpose it could serve even now, or at the very least, it could have served before it became obsolete. And thus enters our bug jar. In it is a variety of species. I believe the first was a praying mantis, and here we have a moth, several bees. Given that it's been, of course, a month of time, some of them have decayed, even with the minimal oxygen. Again, they only receive oxygen with which to decay when the cap is opened. And I don't like to do that because it smells like ass. But inside, we'll see mostly bees, because I believe there's a beehive located nearby our premises, and they often go near the water because they see pretty plants floating and believe they are flowers, or other reasons. I'm not as much of a bee scientist as I would like to be. But there are, of course, other creatures inside here, the moth, as aforementioned, and God help me, I'll have to get a better look. Oh, that's bad. Certain small grasshoppers, other creatures, a single outer wing of a giant Japanese green beetle, and so on and so on. What have I learned from this? Quite a bit, actually. You would think it's some mindless, aimless dive into the very severely deluded minds, and something that raises a lot of concern. And it does, and it is, but there's more to it than that. As a bit of proof, before I get into it, that yes, this has actually been a month. You would think you could collect a lot more than this, but that was one of the goals of the project, to figure out how many bugs are dying, and how much, if you start collecting them, how much are you going to end up with? Not really a lot, but I like to think I did pretty alright. I was not as diligent with this project as I would have liked to have been, because it's always hard to introduce a new habit, especially when it's so abnormal. But using my trusty toothpicks, this is like the third pair because they keep getting broken. I would go out each morning, look for dead bugs on the pool, because that was the inception of this experiment, and then just to pump up those numbers, I would go and I would check windowsills, I would check, because the very first insect that I found that helped contribute to this idea was the praying mantis that I found on the edge of a window. And I will use my little toothpicks, like tweezers, pick it up, place it inside. Sometimes I'd use my bare hands if the situation required, but I would keep a rubber band around it to hold the toothpicks in place. Of course, this is long broken, so now I just keep them nearby because I don't want to ruin another rubber band for these purposes. But the things that I've learned from this project surprised me. They actually surprised me. Not all of them are new. I'm not saying I've made any groundbreaking contributions to science just yet, but they have affirmed things that I've known to be true but never really experienced myself in person. For example, I would leave it alternatingly in the sun and then in the shadow to see if that had any effect. As it happens, it did. Not only would it smell way worse when you took it out of the sun, and yes, I had to test this because, thank Paul Venus in heaven, it doesn't make any scent unless you remove the cap. None at all, which also helps indicate to me that it was actually airtight. The bottle, the jar, when placed in the sun, what happens? What happens to moisture when you heat it? It evaporates and it rises upwards. But I didn't leave any extra water. Again, I didn't put any soil, any leaves, any nitrates or nitrites, no other factors in this aside from the bugs themselves. And there's still moisture. There will always be moisture. I did not make a point of freeze drying these because I wasn't that hungry at the time and because it would deprive me of more data. And I'm glad that I made that decision because I found a very curious phenomenon was happening. When I left this out in the sun, specifically the sun, and came back to it a day or so later, there would be bugs all across the top. Normally they're all at the bottom because I, of course, shake them down to keep them close by, but they would be up around the top, and you can still see some residue, if you look close enough, of them having been there. And I believe the reason for that is because the moisture in these carcasses is getting heated by the sun, and it evaporates and wants to rise upwards, but there's not a lot of it left. And as it rises, it would probably tug and pull on the lighter pieces of the the bugs, as it goes up. But there's still moisture inside them, as is in all creatures, as water is one of the fundamental building blocks of life. And I believe that when it gets hot enough, even if it stays inside, it pulls them upwards, and that's why only the lightest ones would find themselves along the top. There are some ant segments up here, there is a single fly wing, there are bits and pieces from all manner of other insects. And it wasn't just insects, I would find dead house spiders too, of course. This is second to the most intriguing thing I learned. Any child who lives in kind of a sunny area, or at least where there's flowers, anywhere you can find bees, has heard at one point or another the classic bee myth that when you kill one bee, which of course I've heard but I would never do because I don't kill things, it releases a chemical that will alert other drones from the hive to come and understand that there's danger. And biologically speaking, this makes a lot of sense. Insects are eusocial creatures, and they don't focus as individuals so much as they work as one giant organism. You've probably heard about the paradigm that states that ants are not intelligent creatures, but as the idea is that the larger a colony of ants becomes, the smarter of an artificial intelligence they make up, and it grows, as they get larger. And so this made sense, fundamentally made sense. It would make sense for a bee to be able to do this, and I had never seen it happen. Because, of course, this is a very abstract concept. You could say that, yes, if you were to kill a bee, then, you're probably in an area that has bees, and then through that logic, there will probably be more bees, and then once you have that confirmation bias established, you will say, well, I killed one bee, and now I see more bees. So that is tantamount to evidence of this concept happening in real time. There was no way for me to test this, because I wouldn't want to kill anything just for the purposes of science, until I started this project. This has also given me some more information that I probably wouldn't have even known otherwise, even if someone had told me, because the chemicals that attract these insects last longer than you might imagine. By the time that I find these bees in my pool, generally fully lifeless, I would never, if it's still moving, I'll wait, I'll fish it out, put it on dry land, wait for it to fly away, and if it doesn't fly away and eventually dies, then yes, into the jar it goes. The chemicals, I believe, that cause these insects to attract each other post-mortem last longer than you might think, because even some that have been for a whole day, I would handle them. And of course, I usually use the toothpicks, but they're not always available. You know, sometimes I just have to be quick for one reason or another, and I would use my bare hands. Bottom line, I got a lot of dead bee juice on my hands. Not in one sitting, I wasn't, filling up on bees, I'm not such a glutton, but over time. And this is between, washing my hands to go back in the house and cleaning myself and getting other scents and touching food and other things happening to me. Lots of overlapping scents. The chemical is more powerful than you might imagine. Because despite this, I noticed an increased rate of bee activity around me. Once I had handled enough over for a couple of days, and I paid attention to this, because there's always a bee or two, that's what having a bee population is. That's what it boils down to. But these were more. There would be 4 or 5 at a time, and moving around, and always fascinated with me. They always flew around me, and normally when a bee goes near me, I just hold still till it loses interest. But I actually got a little spooked. I forgot my sciences, and I would move out of the way and run. I didn't swat at them. I never do that. But it still freaked me out at first, until it made me tremendously excited, because this was very new and interesting information. I took note of this. I took note of all of it. I took note of the evaporation and other properties and things that are too insignificant to discuss now. And this was by far the most interesting piece, because not only did I have evidence that I had lived by, and I could prove that this concept was happening in real time, I had also been, a little bit of a part of an environment, I did something that caused something to happen back to me. And that's always a cool feeling, because we often forget, yes, our concrete jungles and our cities are probably detached and they're the only truly man-made environment, but the suburbs and houses with a garden and small animals and healthy communities living around there, you are still part of the environment. You still have a contribution, which many people forget, and that's why our carbon footprints grow out of hand. You take a 11-minute shower every day, you throw things out without eating all the food first, and you make the planet worse. But that's a topic for another video. Rewinding back along the tangent I had just followed, this was interesting to me. Interesting for a reason. Because what did I set out to do? I set out to collect dead insects, specifically dead bees, because they were the most common, and I thought it was such a waste that they just appear in the pool every day, and then they're dead. And then if no one fishes them out, they probably dissolve in the pool water, but that nutrients doesn't get back to anything else. A pool is kind of like a dead zone, because that's chlorine. That was the stuff that we used to kill people, and even though it's in small enough amounts to just have an antibacterial property now, it still has negative effects on the environment. I like the idea of someday leaving this house behind and draining the pool and filling it with fresh water, and then revisiting in a few years and seeing if the garden has grown further with no man-made contact, and if creatures are living in the water, as these small ones often do. And I will get to that. That is one thing I will get to once I finally finish the topic of these bees. Because I had set out to do one thing. Many things, but one of the things I set out to do was to have more dead bees. But without killing them. I never kill. And because I had been handling dead bees, the other bees could smell the chemicals on me, so statistically, more bees in the area, which means statistically, more bees could hit the water and drown without me being there to save them, and so statistically, there were more dead bees. But that's interesting, because that was me indirectly turning my will into reality. Through a series of events, I desired more bee corpses to study, and more bee corpses there was. And that was interesting. And that was a very small example, but it really is an interesting thought process. If we look at science from a different way, as opposed to being in our shiny ivory towers with our pristine lab coats and instruments, and taking everything we know about everything and using it to know a little bit more, and we compare that to just participating and being one with an environment, just being a player, You know, just being a player in the game instead of a shoutcaster on the side, calling out, you know, special moves in which team you think is going to win Worlds. That said, it was interesting, and it gave me several ideas, which I won't expand on now, but could help with future projects. The last thing I want to talk about is a mystery that had been bothering me quite a while that I finally managed to solve now. Some creatures are so adapted to living with humanity, pigeons, raccoons, rats, Toxoplasmosis gondii, you know, the cat parasite, that it's difficult to imagine them living out in the wild. But indeed they came. There are wild hamsters. There are animals that always came from somewhere. Some were bred in captivity, but for the most part, there's a genetic root to all creatures we have today that leads back to the environment. And it's hard to picture, not roaches, you know. You can study it, you can know what did bedbugs do before they found people? Why are they adapted to living in soft surfaces? Well, they actually were bird parasites, and they would live in the nests of birds, and then they would prey on the birds parasitically. I did not know where silverfish came from. I was willing to believe they could live in the wild. They have several useful natural abilities. They can flatten themselves and move under small surfaces. They can eat tough materials. They can crawl up walls, as many insects are able to. But I didn't know specifically where they lived, you know? How did they get into a house? They don't just appear there. It's not like 16th century alchemical sciences, the four humors, where we thought if you leave rotting meat out, some of the meat transforms into maggots, which transforms into flies. We know by now that nothing comes from nowhere. I didn't know where silverfish come from. But a few summers back, I would find these small creatures in my pool that looked unmistakably like shrimp, like little krill, or about yay big, definitely curled over, but their body had a very bright red, mottled appearance, and they looked exactly like little shrimp. And this was confusing to me, because I had seen nothing else in the garden that looked anything like this. I couldn't figure out what it might have been. But then I thought, well, lobsters aren't red until you cook them, not shrimp for that matter, and I could go downstairs and fetch a pack of frozen shrimp to prove it, but I have my shrimp privileges revoked for another incident. The point is, most creatures that turn bright red after being cooked start out gray. And what would have cooked these? The sun, which means they must have been in the water for some time. And of course, nothing that's adapted to living in the water is going to appear in a pool and then survive in that pool. That just doesn't happen. So I had to know where they were coming from. But for a long time, I had to give up on that because I didn't have enough evidence to go off of. But recently, I found a living one during this project because I had made the choice to pay more attention to the creatures that I found in the water. And this one was still alive. And I scooped it out of the water. It wasn't red, it was gray, as predicted. It curled around a bit, and then it jumped. And that was the most interesting piece of evidence. It jumped. And I thought they were silverfish, looked it up. They were springtails, something of that ilk. The point is, that is the third and perhaps most significant thing I learned from this project. Anyway, that is the Bug Jar 1 month in review. Thank you for watching. Have a happy and safe Halloween. Remember to vote.